All right, we are back. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Welcome back to Culture Insanity, the podcast. We are in season 4, episode number 4, and we have another guest with us today. So, of course, we have Pastor Monty, we have myself, and today we have
Pastor Dave.
Pastor Dave. So, Pastor David has been a partner with us for the last, I don't know, a couple years or so. Two years, 3 years, 4 years.
Time flies.
Yeah. So he's been a part of our cross-examination panel discussions. Where we're talking about all these different theological issues and cultural issues and how we should address them as Christians and as pastors. And so, yes, he's been a church partner of us. His church, Prince of Peace, is in Battleground, Washington. So he is joining us today as our next guest on the show. We're going to talk about all things crazy going on in pop culture. So thanks for coming, David. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. And as you can see, David wore a very appropriate shirt today in preparation of our show. So yeah, we're back, and thank you guys for coming. So we have a few things on our docket today, and as usual, we'll get to what we get to. We have all these things prepared, and the flow of discussion, takes us where it takes us in the hour that we have. So, as you might have seen on our, different social media posts advertising our show, we're going to be talking about some Pixar news that we find ourselves, reading about today. On top of that, we got Disney in the news, along with a bunch of other pop culture juggernauts in terms of what they're involved with. We're going to be talking about culture appropriation. Justin Bieber and Gwen Stefani find themselves in the heat of that decades-long debate and an issue. And then if we get to it, as we were talking about off air just now, Kevin Smith, Silent Bob from the Jay and Silent Bob movies, he's auctioning off his movie in the as a non-fungible token. I got that right. Non-fungible token, an NFT. So like crypto, the whole crypto world. So again, those are the things we got on the docket. We'll get to what we get to, and I think these guys have, already, read up on the different articles we're sourcing from. So, it should be good. So let's just get right into it. So Pixar is the first thing on our thing today. You guys both read about what Pixar's got going on. So Pixar, for those of you that don't know that are listening and watching, Pixar is in the news right now because they have put out a casting call for their first transgender character, basically. And I don't know if that means that their casting call is for specifically a transgender actor/actress. I didn't really get that from the article. Did you guys get that? They're just looking for someone to fill a character that will be transgender. Is that how you interpreted that? In the article?
Yeah, that's what I saw.
That's a whole nother sidebar, because nowadays it's not enough to have representation in a movie. You have to have the actual person who's playing the character has to be of that whatever you call it, demographic or whatever.
Well, that's something that I've been kind of watching with sort of horror, is that this kind of gets rid of acting, period. Right? If you remember, the Coen brothers, famous for "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," got into trouble because they had too
I think they're
many.
famous for Fargo, but that's neither here nor there.
Well, there's Fargo, there's "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," there's the best movie, the Hudsucker Proxy, ever. So they get into trouble because they get into trouble because they tell stories, and the stories are very specific, right? Fargo set in North Dakota. Everybody in the movie in North Dakota, actually it's in Minnesota.
Yeah.
It all takes place around Brainerd, Minnesota. Everybody's white. Why? Because Brainerd is a white monoculture.
And they all speak a certain way because...
and if you watch it for the way they speak, it's just... that's not why we watch it. With family, but they got in trouble because, they don't have enough black representation. They don't have enough women. They don't have... Although having the sheriff be a woman in Fargo... and their point back was, no, this is a story about then. This is a story about the South at this particular time, and this is completely accurate to when we wrote it. And you can't have a story if you have to we have to have an equal number of whites and blacks and men and women, or we have to have a gay paraplegic black woman, check all the boxes. That's not a story. It's, it's just it's a checklist.
Right.
And so, it's kind of interesting with Pixar. do we have to have the transition story animated or
Mm.
computerized for kids? Is that where this is going? Or is it just a part of the character, or are they just looking for transgender people to do voices?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's I don't know exactly what they're hoping for, but yeah, they put out the casting call and they're, looking to fill this role of this character in an upcoming movie, which I don't think it's been disclosed yet necessarily. I didn't see that. Like, whatever. They're making a movie and it's going to have this character, and they put out a casting call saying you need to be this, this, and this. And so they're making the headlines because, I don't know, they're doing the Lord's work here. They're doing the culture's work. They're trying to be as inclusive as possible, and they've sort of been dipping their toes in this in the last several years. There's that movie they just came out with. I think it was last year. Onward. It had the voices of Chris Pratt and the kid Spider-Man. I don't remember his name. Tom Holland. And in that movie, like at the very end of the movie, there's like a 2-second scene where a woman police officer like embraces what is supposed to be like her girlfriend and like kisses her or something. So they sort of been testing the waters, is what I was, reading about. And I saw that movie, so I saw that. But before, they've also, they're not intersectional enough, right? They get in trouble because that's pandering. That's all you're gonna do, and we're supposed to hurrah you Pixar for doing these things. You're just pandering, and it's offensive, and da 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 da. Now they're maybe taking this next step, trying to please the masses, which of course you can never do, right? You can never be doing enough work because of ultimately you'll not be intersectional enough, as is the as the current discussion amongst critics of this culture that we're in, us. But my question to you guys is, I have a few to sort of keep the discussion going and generated, but do you guys find, as, you're an older parent, but you have grandkids, you're a parent, you have what, 4 kids? Four kids. Do you guys find it increasingly harder to subject your kids, like willingly subject your kids to these companies like Pixar, who seem to be moving forward with this current, cultural demand for these things that we, of course, don't agree with, and we have things to say about, strong things to say about your identity and your sexual, orientation and your gender, your race, your all these things. Is it hard for you as pastors, as parents, as grandparents, whatever we're talking about, to like willingly put your kids in front of that stuff? And I say that not wanting to sound like, stuck up Christian or whatever, but it's true. Like, they're promoting what we would call sinful behavior, lifestyle, evil, Is it okay to willingly put your kid in front of that? Like, should we feel different about that? And then as a branch of that, and I'll let you guys talk here in just a second, like, do we put things like that on a scale, like sin and evil, whatever? Like, do we put it on a scale where we're willing to put them in front of this, but not in front of this? Like, would you put your kid in front of a murder scene because you like willingly? Like, does it seem to be a scale that we are operating in? I don't know. What do you guys think? We can just sort of organically go about it.
Well, for me, there are 2 issues.
Mm-hmm.
The first issue would be that there are a vast number of parents and grandparents out there who recognize these companies as for what they were. So they grew up with Disney. They grew up with, which was not overt back in the day. They grew up with Pixar as when it first started. They grew up with other entertainment industry companies that were not as overt in what they were doing, and so there's an element of ignorance in regard to what these companies have morphed into. And so my wife and I, we our position is that before we subject our children, which are grown now, so it's pointless, but our grandchildren, before we're going to subject them to anything, we're going to watch what's in question ourselves and make a determination as to whether it's content that will provide discussion, or it's content that we don't want to have, because because one of the things that we've been talking about here in church, and I was talking about this 30 years ago, 40 years ago, is that as believers, we have an obligation to recognize that media is a vehicle through which culture is affected, and it used to be subversive. It used to be they didn't talk about that, and now you listen to producers and directors and people who make these movies and music and what have you, and they say outright that they believe it's their business to affect change within culture towards these various things. So you're you're not going to protect your children or your grandchildren by putting them in a bubble. What you are going to be able to do, though, is you are going to be able to say, if you're going to watch this, we're going to watch it together, and then we're going to have a discussion and critique the material that is there and why it's inappropriate for a believer to be aligned with this type of material.
I think that's right. I do this actively, and it used to be with the kids, like, how old do I think you need to be to see my favorite movies? Because they're just great. And now it's increasingly like, no, I want to watch that, or I want to read about what the themes are first. And I have, edited out the last two Pixar movies, or I don't know, sequentially, but Coco, because it represents a non-Christian worldview of death. And then the newest one with the poor guy who falls down the hole and becomes a ghost. It's a whole jazz story.
Oh, Soul.
Yeah. Right? No, that's not how this works. And I don't want you watching this and getting the wrong idea about Christian metaphysics, because that's not appropriate.
Right.
And increasingly, it's one of those things with the plank in your own eye sort of things about, the adults and most of the Christians I know are fine watching all sorts of things because we have that filter, but Christ calls us to be holy as he is holy and to flee from impropriety. I'm going to stop hitting the mic here. And we're kind of in there, but we subject our kids to all kinds of impropriety because it's just in the movie that we like. And so we're picking which impropriety.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it's like, well, no, you can't actually do that. You can't be consistent because otherwise the poor kids are just watching.
It's just so untenable, right? If you're going to carry that through, then can you carry it through?
Well, what's the name of it? Is when I was a little kid, is it McGee and Me? There was a kind of a Baptist animated fun show, but it came out in like 1985 or 88, and we thought it was just the best when we were little kids because you could watch it at church, and it was our version of VeggieTales.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
But now you're down to just that, and your kids are going to have to hit popular culture at some point. And it kind of circles around that question from Rob Dreher in the Benedict option as to when do you pull your kids out, when do you pull yourself out? Is it your job to oppose culture to your death or to your unemployment or to your kids getting pulled out of school or whatever? Or do you need to protect them and just say, this it, we've gotten too far and we're out?
Yeah, and we're talking specifically about movies and that, but even if you watch network television today, you're still going to have to address these issues because they are actively incorporating LGBT. They're actively incorporating, homosexual couples living together, and so they're promoting lesbianism and what have you as if it's normal. And again, they used to be subtle about it. Over the last 2 years, my wife and I have just noticed that it's pretty overt, and we generally, we watch things like NCIS and those types of programs that are cop type programs, and they're quite overt now.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny you bring up NCIS because about 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, and it was sad we didn't get to find out what happened to Ziva and Tony. Like at the end, like that's about when we stopped watching NCIS because it was this growing sense of disgust on my part that every episode has to have a gay person. And it's not just an ancillary sort of, token homosexual.
Right.
It's so across TV, every show at that point seemed to have at least one main homosexual character. And I just was looking at how many people are in the show and was like, wait a minute, you're trying to portray that 25% of the population is homosexual by your representation.
Yeah, they're trying to make it normative.
And that's not actually statistically true.
It's like, what, 5% or less?
Well, less than that.
No, it's down in the 1.5 to 2, depending. And
I was being generous.
Well, and there's
the point is taken though.
Right. So then the other question, kind of circling around with this, yes, it's getting harder, and yes, there's a concerted effort. Maybe Monty was talking about that before, but they are definitely trying to drive. This is our job to put this out there. Do you just give up on Disney and Pixar altogether?
Well, that's kind of where
or do you just ones and twos on it?
Right? And that's sort of where I'm trying to juggle and figure it out, because the tendency and what you're told to do, or what we're taught, is if you don't agree with this, then you're against it, like baby out with the bathwater. Like it's and that's how people treat their politics, right? There's no, I agree with you on this, but I disagree. Like you're either with me or you're against me. It's right. Two-sided, And so do we treat the medias like that, or should we treat the medias like that? Is it ones and twos, or is it you need to just avoid this because it's heading in a direction that's counterproductive to our worldview and lifestyle and what it promotes as normal and these things. So it's difficult because you don't want to be, on the one hand, like the identity politics type side, right? Where it's you're either with me or against me, like Sith status, But on the other hand, it's like, well, is it wise to just continue to take that in? And I don't know.
Well, I stated this earlier, but I'll say it again, but in a different fashion. The difficulty is that when Scripture tells us that we're to be in the world but not of the world, it means that we're to understand the culture that we live in and what's going on around us. So part of our ability to be able to minister to the needs of people is to understand the issues that they face. And so while you don't need to be participating in those things, clearly one of the things that is detrimental, in my view, one of the things that is detrimental to the church at large is that there are many people out there that go under the moniker of Christian who have no concept or idea whatsoever about how their faith interacts with the culture they live in.
Yeah, and so they essentially become useless.
Yeah, they have a monastic philosophy. They cloister themselves and they say, I ain't going to touch that. Yeah. But my position is that we need to understand, first of all, there's nothing new under the sun.
Nope.
There's nothing new under the sun. So the early church dealt with these types of issues. We just deal with it in a different dress, but it is still there. And our obligation and responsibility as we teach our children and as we teach within the church is to help people understand that culture may change, but Scripture doesn't change. And God's position on these things doesn't change. And that, when somebody says to me, well, Pastor Monty, the reality of it is you're just homophobic. My response to that is, what I am or am not is not the issue. God's word says that this is the standard that he sets because he created us as he created us. And I'm not opposed to it. God is opposed to it. And so when you deal with all these types of issues, you have to be informed. And many believers have what I call the ostrich complex. They think they stick their head in the sand. They just think they think if they don't look at it, it's going to go away and not affect them, and that's just not true.
There's a book from the middle of the century by Richard Niebuhr called Christ and Culture, and I commend that to folks. I think he's wrong at certain points, but that's me. But I was thinking about this in regard to all of these, that he's trying to figure out how Jesus deals with culture, but culture's always been opposed to Christ.
Yes.
And I mean, the Scripture just flat out says it, right? They saw him, but they didn't love him. All sorts of things like that. but the least malignant take that you get from culture is sort of the song and dance number from Herod out of Jesus Christ Superstar. As he's doing this, like that's the most benign version of culture. Is you're here to give us a show, you're here to be interesting and entertaining, and then go. And so if you make demands on me, then no. If you make moral demands, then no. And so Christians are left, kind of looking at Christ, and you can have your different views on how he interacts with culture, but we're kind of stuck with a understanding that culture has always hated Christ as he represents the full law of God. They love the saving part. Right. But the whole, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, every single yod and tilde, or yot and tittle, depending on where your translation comes from, they don't like that you get to get the salvation, but you also get to have the complete holiness, or at least strive for it here in this life.
Yeah.
Right? Those are always going to be at odds. And so as parents, right, and Pastor Monty, since your kids are older, right, you really get this, but we're just stuck, right? Adam and I are stuck with little kids, and we're watching them grow up, but as adults, you're like, you are what you are now, and we pray for our kids and pray that they'll continue in God's path, but for parents now, it's kind of like, this is horrible.
One of the things that we talk about in my podcast, Truth Time with Pastor Monty, we're going to be getting into, what we've been talking about is relationship between parent and child, but when a child is small, your two jobs predominantly are to tell them what to do and to rescue them when they have issue. As they grow, you have to begin to transition away from that into being a master communicator. And what many parents don't do is they never break away from telling their kids what to do and or allowing them to suffer consequence. And when your kids become older, you have to lay the groundwork to begin a communication with your children to be able to address things we're talking about, because their ability to reason, their ability to make differentiations, their ability to understand consequence for action, either positive or negative, are going to be a dynamic part of who they are as an individual. And where I would see most parents have difficulty is that they never establish those lines of communication as their children grow and allow that relationship to develop.
Yeah. Gone are the days where you can put your kid in front of a TV, as if you ever should have done that, and expect them to walk away safely. A couple comments. Somebody likes your shirt, so that's good. You've won at least one fan. Heidi Parker says, what was once considered safe with Disney, with Disney, Pixar, Warner Brothers, cartoons, etc., are just showing their true nature that has always been there as a non-Christian worldview. So the safety net that wasn't there in the first place is finally being seen as a spike strip under you. It was never safe to begin with.
Yeah, I think Heidi's right.
Yeah. Well, there's this whole myth that, as a pastor, I have to deal with, that basically America from 1946 until 1990 was a Christian nation, was remarkably Christian. No. We had our cultural mores and we set them at that point, but it's actually harder to deal with folks, because if you just get into the cult of I'm a good person, I'm a good citizen, I do what I'm supposed to do, I keep up with the Joneses, I mow my lawn and I pay my taxes, there's not a whole lot of room to introduce, but yeah, you're still a sinner. Right? And so I like that all of these movies from Disney, from Bambi on up through Toy Story to get a Pixar one, those are innocent. That's fine, largely. But that doesn't mean they're Christian.
Right.
And we can find Christian themes, because you can find Christian themes wherever you go.
Right.
And wonderful talking points, but that's not the same as being actually Christian.
Or at least they always had the storyline of good versus evil, good wins.
Right.
And that's not even true now.
Yeah.
Well, and it's
evil is just misunderstood.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, and
evil isn't evil. It's just you've always been misunderstood.
Well, I mean, there's the retelling things
and you're
that
really good.
those stories like Maleficent, where we're going to retell from the
Oh,
other,
my
and
goodness,
those are
yes.
fun for the adults,
Yes.
right? I mean, that's a very interesting sort of point. But the good versus evil, and it's always a milquetoast evil, and the good always wins, which doesn't really prepare you for life. So let's all watch the second worst Star Wars ever, right? Which is Empire Strikes Back. I know everybody loves it, but
Well, that's a controversial comment, but keep going.
right. But in that one, evil wins, right? And it sets you up for number 3, and so or
Maybe telling that people love that one
So
so good
evil,
so much.
so evil appears to win.
right. Well, and you kind of get
called a
that. It
cliffhanger.
appears, but at that point, especially if you're at my age, you knew that, well, we'll just get out Return of the Jedi, right? And watch good win again, right?
Right.
But, to some extent, I want to build that fantasy for the little guys of good does win, and kind of get that because, man, what a horrible world to just say, well, sometimes evil wins and sometimes good wins. We can introduce you to that when you get into a junior high because that is essentially junior high.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Even as an adult, like I was talking about this in church a couple weeks ago, those movies that portray that, and I'm not talking about kids movies at this point. I'm talking about like, dark dramas or whatever, that where the movie ends on just a bad note, like whether it's evil or whether it's, I mean, call it what it is. It just ends on that gut punch of a note. Even as an adult, those movies are not enjoyable. Like I can
no, they're
appreciate
not.
them for different aspects of the movie. It was really well acted, or it was tragic because of these reasons. But at the end of the day, I don't need to be reminded that sometimes that happens. Like that something bad ends as bad. So
well,
as a
we
kid,
missed out,
even more.
right? Like on the cop shows, because I love cop shows, on the procedural and the whodunit, and especially when the procedural works and it's drawn out. Let me draw your attention to Bosch, long procedural kind of drama. But
This is a Showtime show,
I think so.
or maybe Amazon.
I know it's on Amazon,
Yeah.
but it's all about getting the bad guy. And so when the bad guy gets got, sometimes, the bad guy gets shot and you're like, yay. Or sometimes the bad guy gets arrested and we're like, well, let's hope they go to jail. But all of that aligns over the actual evil the bad guy's done. And you miss out on all of the human tragedy because nobody wants to watch that, right? There's a whole sort of, kind of philosophy of we're only doing this to escape reality. So you can go and read about that in the Poetics from Aristotle, where he talks about catharsis. And the only reason we go to the theater is so that we don't have to kill our neighbor. We can watch our neighbor get killed up on stage and go, oh, sweet. Well, okay. So it's not that big of a deal, right? And that's why we watch these shows. But for the adults, especially picking up the pieces for a bunch of evil that's happened in the world as a pastor, good wins at the end of the show. And we need it to win at the end of the show because the rest of our life is picking up all these pieces of the impact of evil, or then our bad decisions.
That's where I'm at.
As a result of evil.
Yes.
Right? Other people do evil, I get hurt, or the people around me get hurt. And there's not really recourse, and there's not really a good thing other than to say, okay, how are we going to redeem this situation, or how are we going to, get a new job, or what are we going to do in the new life with grandma who's now paralyzed after the drunk driving accident or whatever. Sorry to be grim, but that's part of it.
Yeah. As expected, you drew some criticism for your Star Wars comment.
Well, I did not say, and I said second worst, right? Because we all agree that episode 1 should just be uninvented. Right?
Uninvented. Josh wants to say that Empire is the best. Evil only wins because Luke doesn't follow Yoda's advice. It's a morality tale.
Oh, that's probably true. But, now we've seen Grogu eating frogs. And, I got to rewatch all of the Dagobah scene now knowing that Yoda is the apex predator.
That's awesome.
Y'all just think too hard about this stuff.
No.
I had a good time watching. I don't generally pick them apart, but the whiny Anakin as a kid and Jar Jar Binks, which is just the worst character on the face of the planet.
Have you ever watched that movie? Side note, and we can move on to the next topic. But next time you choose to subject yourself to that movie, because it will be a choice on your part, maybe to teach your kids about what bad filmmaking is or something. Every time Jar Jar gets on the screen, literally ask yourself the question, what is he doing for the movie at this moment? What is he doing for the plot? What is he doing for this character? How is he helpful in any way, shape, or form? And yes, I've seen the YouTube videos about the theory that Jar Jar was the Sith Lord the whole time and whatever. But next time you watch that movie, just ask, okay, so what is Jar Jar doing now? Like, what good? What good is he doing for the movie, for this character? How is he developing this, that, or the other thing? And you come up with zero.
Oh, no, actually, that's the most offensive part to me, is that his bumbling around actually makes the movie move. So there's a bunch of parts where the whole thing...
He's basically the screen wipe.
Right.
He's the new screen wipe.
Well, he's kind of a Deus Ex
bumbling around.
Machina sort of character of like, we don't get any further without Jar Jar rolling a 7. But then, to just make the entire world focus on this bumbling rube, and that's why we win is just painful.
All right, let's move on. Spent half the show on Pixar.
I normally have two words that come to mind whenever I watch the whole Star Wars thing and wow and really.
Okay.
That's
you.
Yeah, that's me.
Space wizards.
Yeah. Okay, so Disney, among other many I don't know, juggernauts in culture, Coca-Cola, Disney, Netflix, all these big guys are participating or supporting this new Equality Act. So I'm going to let one of you guys, maybe you, briefly describe what the Equality Act is in relation to what's going on with these big companies like Disney and Coca-Cola and Netflix and Hulu and there's a whole list of them. But you read the article, I'm sure.
I read the article. I mean, the bottom line is that this is an addendum to the
civil rights.
Well, it's really an addendum to the whole issue of where do we get our value from?
Okay.
So Black Lives Matter, et cetera, where there's been an emphasis in society to say your value is linked to something that you have no control over. And if you're not the special thing where there is, so if you're not the right color, or you're not the right deal,
identified
then
this way sexually, or
you're not of any value. And this is an addendum to that, saying, basically speaking, we don't like the phrase that all men are created equal in our Constitution. Rather, we're going to gravitate towards the idea that we need to have equity, that all groups are represented appropriately. And so, and that's the reason why you see this heavy emphasis then for all of these groups to try to include with this whole intersectionality thing, all these different groups vying for position to say that they're as legitimate as anybody else. Because, of course, that's where they derive their value from. But what's happening within each of the groups is that these groups then, which is, that's the makeup of man, these men and women, these groups then try to destroy the other groups and make them of no value at all. So you have them that then trying to cancel out other groups. But that's really what the point is, to do away with the idea you have value because of who God created you to be. All are created equal because God created you, to say, no, that's not true. Your value comes from, there's no value to a white person whatsoever. But your value comes from being black or being homosexual or being lesbian or transgen or whatever. I mean, it's crazy.
Do you want to fill in any blanks before I ask a couple questions regarding it?
No, that kind of seems to be the on the face of it, kind of, we're gonna trade. I think equity is the dumbest idea ever for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
I'll go back to William Buckley from his bit with Gore Vidal. I'm not that old, but
I was going to say, my goodness, you're dating yourself.
Well, that was 20 years before I was born, so woo!
Yeah.
But Buckley has this really good point where he says there's no such thing as equality if you have freedom, because everybody makes different choices, and as soon as you make one choice that's different, you're no longer equal, right? And you just start this thing rolling, and so there's some choices that we should maybe proscribe and say, yeah, you shouldn't get that choice. Although in America, that's kind of a tougher sell. But he actually happens to be right. And our entire society is based on that. And so I'm all for, find me the real racists, not the people with a different political opinion, but the people doing horrendous things based on race. And let's go fight them together and re-educate them and tell them this is not Christ-like and this is not appropriate. But once that's stopped, let's let everybody make their own choices again.
Right.
So,
and be responsible to the consequence of the choice.
right. Well, and so, I kind of think there's kind of a twofold sort of thing going on. The culture at large likes the idea of this because everybody wants everybody to win at the end, and kind of it's from the same good versus evil thing. And I want everybody to win, but I have one of those jobs where I see lots of people who try their hardest and lose, because that's how it is, whether it's the natural consequences or their own previous choices or whether it's ordained by God. Sometimes he calls you home, right? And you lost that cancer battle. So that's part when we can talk about it. But the other half of this is actually intensely political and is a work of one political party trying to silence the church. And I don't think it's anything else than that.
Right.
I think that this is just a straight attack on the church. And I can hear all the people shouting about, no, we just want everybody to win and equity. But none of the politicians are actually talking about that.
No, they're not.
One of the quotes from the article that Josh posted on the video. So if you're watching and you're reading about it now, at the end of it, this is coming from the president of a seminary school in somewhere in the South. I can't remember.
Right.
He says the Equality Act therefore represents the threat of government coercion against a certain structure of theology, doctrine, and morality. This means the threat of the state directed against any claim of divine revelation that contradicts the new morality, the newly minted definition of merit, and the newly constructed rights of the LGBTQ revolution. So exactly to your point, like it's an attempt to overthrow what's previously been put in place to allow those things to, to however you want to say that, disagree, allow them to disagree, to put it,
Well, and, to those who are Christians who are afraid, okay, on the one hand, we survived under Rome, we'll survive under the Equality Act should it be passed, but it has to be passed. And then there's going to be test cases, and it really will depend on whether the federal government actually gives you and honors your due process, or whether they shunt you off into a human rights sort of committee, the bureaucrats, and then you never get your day in court. And so, as we watched with Sweet Cakes with Doug and Melissa, right, their due process is violated across the board.
This is the bakery.
This is the bakery with the gay wedding cake. Right? In Colorado just across the board never gives them their day. They're charged with a actual crime, they're fined, and they never get a day in court until they sue and end up at I believe it's the state Supreme Court, and they lose, and then they win at the national Supreme Court of the United States, who doesn't find in their favor, who finds that finds in their favor, but not for freedom reasons, just finds that Colorado has had a direct and personal animus against this couple, which is not the ruling that we were all hoping for.
Right.
But it's a very different court today than the court that found for them 2 years ago, and the majority and the argumentation will be different. And so you could, should the Equality Act be passed, have a 5 or 7 year kind of slog with churches being essentially fined out of existence by various states until they get to the Supreme Court, and then we kind of have it out there and hopefully get a decent result. Having watched a lot of these, I don't think that the state can actually act against churches without displaying the animus they actually have. So I don't know that we'll actually get to one of these where it's just the just the facts of the case and just whether or not you can do it. I think there's always going to be this additional kind of the bureaucrats are running around crazy in glee and doing horrendous things and violating your rights all over.
Yeah, I mean, eventually, what we see is we see when the Constitution of the United States was originally set up, it was set up to, particularly with what was going on in England, and people keeping in mind that there was a a desire to control people through the church, and when the Constitution was set up, the church was specifically exempted from many things because of the fact, and so that religious liberty was put in there to offer a protection, because ideally the experiment of the United States was that it was a new society with new protections built in for the individual, and it was and religious faith and belief was recognized to be true, and people were encouraged to openly have that happen in an open society. What we see happening now is that there is an effort, a strong effort. Now it's been there for probably the last 40 or 50 years that the effort has been going on, but now it's coming to a head where they're actively trying to destroy the church's position in an open society, and what it will do, it will drive us underground. Their desire is either to remove the idea that churches are somehow exempt from many of the regulations which others would have to deal with, and so by doing that, the other aspect is they'll either do it in these ways, or they will go after a church exemption for what's happening as far as the Internal Revenue Code is concerned, or they will try to bankrupt churches through not being able to legally battle what's going on, and so they'll just drive churches. Basically, what's going to happen is that those who are true to the Word of God will be driven underground.
So I have a couple questions that I believe have been answered in a more in-depth way, but to put it plainly, do you guys think that in this effort to create equity, equal treatment, we're actually seeing the anti version of that? Like, in an effort to create equity, what we're actually seeing is just a forced worldview?
Well, yeah, because nobody's interested in equity. Everybody's interested in retribution. And the only version of equity that's coming out of the left is we'll only be equal when all the white people are gone and we have all their stuff. Or we'll only be equal and we'll only be made right when all the Christians are martyred, depending on which version of the left you're in. And so it's not about making us equal or restoring us. If we were actually interested in restoration, there's a whole lot of other things that the church would actually stand up and applaud that the culture could do or the government could do.
Sure.
But no. So we're not headed there together. And, one of the other worrisome things, and I've noticed this since I became a pastor, is there's a large swath of the church, of the culture. Some of them are church, some of them are not, who view religious life as a hobby. So these are not deeply held personal beliefs. These are not metaphysical realities. They're just a hobby. So when the government comes in and says you have to provide, for instance, under the Affordable Care Act, you have to provide birth control in your health plan, no matter what, there's no room. And they're just shocked and offended. And the entire argument is, but you can't do this. You can't have those beliefs. And it's not an argument about the beliefs. It's an argument that based on that it's a hobby for me, it's a hobby for you. And so what's the big deal with telling a stamp collecting club, right? Where you don't have metaphysical realities, you don't have deeply held beliefs, you like stamps, right? And so the church is seen as the Audubon Society, well, not as vaunted as the Audubon Society. So a stamp club or a rowing club or a drinking club. And so that's the position of the federal government at this point. And maybe not the elected figurehead, but the day-to-day workers, religion is only a hobby. And if we violate or upset your hobby, it's no big deal. It's just a hobby.
But at least as it's wound its way through the courts, which is takes a lot of time, as you stated earlier. At least both Hobby Lobby and the Roman Catholic, the sisters of
Little Sisters
the
of the
Little
Poor.
Sisters of the
Yeah.
Poor, they were vindicated.
Yeah, they were, and it's one of my points on a completely different side show about how the Affordable Care Act was only looking for consequence-free, publicly funded abortion, and if they just would have gone for that instead of mucking it up with a pretend healthcare scheme, it would have been way cheaper. Because all they ever litigated was on the defense side of it was regulating people getting the abortion coverage, getting the abortifacients, all of the healthcare stuff.
Yeah, the Unaffordable Care Act was hoisted on the American public, and is so false in all kinds of ways.
So I want healthcare too, but there's deep issues, and it's not what the language on the paper says. And this is true for the Equality Act. It's what we're willing to litigate. And so they were forced to defend its existence on a variety of fronts that they weren't looking for that fight, but it found them. But they went after and forced litigation on other people on the birth control and access to abortions and all of those things. So that tells you it's really not a law about healthcare. It's really a law about forcing public abortions, and they should have just taken all that money and opened up free government abortion clinics, and it would have been cheaper. So
on that note, let's move on.
Super.
Let's get back to something a little bit more on the nose, pop culturally. Okay, so culture appropriation specifically. I know David said he has some things to say about this, but Justin,
I'm growing out my hair so that I can have dreadlocks.
nice. Okay, so
I want to see that.
on that note of Pastor Monty getting dreadlocks, Justin Bieber, and Gwen Stefani, formerly of No Doubt, currently of Blake Shelton. They're both in the fire right now, in the thick of it, facing charges of cultural appropriation, and the reason why is because, as Pastor Monty alluded to, Justin Bieber is apparently growing out dreadlocks. They're at the beginning of stages, and that's he's being targeted for inappropriately appropriating Black culture, and I don't know, mocking it or making light of it, taking what is something that they've been traditionally that's been traditionally held against them, or they've been used against them, and using it for his own fame and self whatever. I don't know what you call it. And then on the other end, Gwen Stefani has this new song, this new music video where she's same thing, appropriating Black culture with her style, her look, the way she's dancing, this and that. So they're both sort of in the thick of it, from the Black community in specific right now, but probably woke white people as well.
Mostly woke white people.
Probably, huh? So just as a basic question to start off, what's with this consistent drama surrounding the idea of cultural appropriation? Why does it continue to just dog people?
Well, it's one of the easiest ways to silence somebody is to shout a cultural appropriation, and especially people who are largely innocent, and I'll leave Justin Bieber out of that. Although he seems to have cleaned himself up and gotten his life sort of back on track, let's hope and pray, right? Like
from the outside looking in, it would seem to be that way.
Right. But Gwen Stefani has been largely fairly innocent of most things. And so I kind of suspect this is sort of a attack since her relationship with Blake Shelton of Country Doom, right? So country music is just sort of seen as this monolithically Republican conservative sort of thing, even though it's not, right? So I suspect that's where that's headed. But from our previous conversations via, the before the show, right? It's just all dumb. I mean, yes, you can be offensive, right, with cultural appropriation, and you
Sure.
can intend to wound, but that's not what's going on with either of these people.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's a big deal nowadays. And I think it's a big deal because people those who are on the left who shout loudest about this cultural appropriation thing are always part of their part of their deal is that they have they're busybodies. First of all, I think that there's a huge element of our culture which are just busybodies.
Yep.
They don't
COVID doesn't help.
They don't pay attention to their own life issues, but they want their nose in everybody else's issue. So we have that going on. But they've also found out within the last several years that if they just yell and scream loud enough, that they can cause trouble. They're troublemakers, and the whole cultural appropriation thing. If you want to go back in history and look at particularly in the music industry, look at cultural appropriation. We could talk about Elvis Presley.
Well, I was going to say all of rock,
Yeah.
and then the
Yeah.
whitewashing of jazz, which gave us some fantastic musicians.
Yes.
I mean, it was good jazz. I mean, Lawrence Welk is kind of a low mark, but there are fantastic. I mean, Benny Goodman and
But that's the thing we're seeing though too. On that note, is people are going back in history and I never know how to pronounce the word posthumously when you're
Right. Yeah. Posthumously. Yeah.
canceling people.
right. Well, and again, for music lovers, that's just going to be dumb because I like Benny Goodman and I'm going to keep listening to him. I like Maynard Ferguson. I play the trumpet and he does too, and so it's just going to be great. But I also like Lionel Hampton. And Thelonious Monk. And so, to just go through the jazz folks, one of the the it's dumb is good and bad is bad.
Yeah.
And if you're producing a good product, who cares? And
the artists that you're talking about, and many others like Elvis Presley, for example, they some of them did it well, and some of them sucked.
when I happen to think that Elvis is on I am not an Elvis fan, but there are others who are right in there with him.
Yeah.
Who did it really well.
Yeah.
Mostly I just don't like Elvis's vocal quality. But he was tremendously successful at his time.
He was not well liked only because of his vocal quality.
Well, I'm aware of that.
He had unique stage presence.
Oh yeah, he
That's generous. There's a reason that the television producers would not allow Elvis Presley to be seen above the waist. He had some totally sweet moves. And to that extent, every once in a while you can see those moves in other places, and nobody's screaming at Usher about culturally appropriating Elvis
or Bieber for that matter, who is
I mean with
understudy.
with the dance, the dance stuff. So one of the things that troubles me about this is, like I said, good is good and bad is bad, is underneath there's this presupposition that we can take whatever we want from Western culture and that's open and free, but anything that comes from another culture is sacrosanct. It's hands off, right?
Right.
And so I don't think that's actually the case. I think cultural appropriation is dumb. Don't be offensive. On the other hand, try to hurt people.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if we're going down the cultural appropriation thing, and if you shout about it loudly enough, then I'm going to say no Western medicine for you, no cars for you, no airplanes for you, because those are all Western things that Western people who happen to be white by a bunch of accidents of history, right, ended up creating.
No bluegrass for you.
No well, yeah. So I cannot go back and listen. Well, I can apparently, but listen to bluegrass covers of Michael Jackson hits, because Billie Jean by what's her name?
Billie Jean. Billie Jean by Alison Krauss.
It's just fantastic. So, this is the more offensive part. No, stop Western medicine. If you're worried about cultural appropriation, stop using Western medicine.
Yeah, it's just another one of those things that's
well.
If you're gonna claim that ideology or whatever, then be consistent with it.
Well,
it's untenable.
Well, and it hides a lot of other injustice in the world. There are reasons
it's a very first world problem. We call it.
Right, but if you've watched the news, this is not so much a pop culture thing, but there's a tremendous COVID-19 outbreak in India.
Yeah.
And why India is having this, there's a bunch of cultural stuff that goes on in India that is internal that I won't get into that.
It's Bill Gates' fault.
Kind of. But why aren't we helping them? Because they're half a world away, they're poor, and they're not white, and we cannot, other than intellectual skill, we can't steal any of their natural resources.
Right. Well, the thing is that with cultural appropriation, look, the United States is a mixing pot of cultures to begin with, and has years after its inception, where we begin to have the issue of immigration and people gravitating towards the United States. You have all these different cultures which are represented. The nature of man is that if you see regardless of the culture it comes from, if you see something that you like, then there's a desire for you to associate with that and incorporate it into who you are as an individual because of the creative nature of who we are.
Right.
And then make it your own. So we have all of this culture that surrounds us that comes from other cultures that we like.
Yeah, and it used to be considered like flattery.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
But
yeah,
now
that
it's
that
not.
is the aphorism, right? Imitation is the highest form of flattery.
Yes, exactly.
And if you do it well, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about the entirety of Gwen Stefani's career has been based off
Yeah,
of
Josh mentioned
ska and reggae.
Harajuku Girls. Anyone? She's using Japanese women as part of her new formed solo career.
I was less excited about that than her solo career, although I listened to the album, than the entire time with No Doubt, which has, for the most part, white kids playing just straightforward ska, reggae, kind of that those overtones, and I like No Doubt. it's partially because they came out when I was in high school, and that's always your most cherished music. But it is what it is. So I'd like to kind of see if culture could go away from the whoever shouts the loudest gets the most attention. But
I don't think it will.
Well,
it's really interesting because to your point about American culture in specific, like we used to be, that used to be part of the American identity that we're supposed to like hold so dear, is like we're a melting pot nation, and this makes us great for all these reasons, and we can borrow the best parts of this and this and this and create this great thing. And now, how do you have that while also fearing this? Like
part
makes it not that we should find our identity in being American,
Well, no. Part of the problem is that the current society, the society that exists today, so millennials on down, are woefully historically ignorant.
Yes.
And so they don't have
final thoughts. We got a few minutes
want or desire historically to understand where we've come from and where we're headed to, because they just dismiss that altogether. And that's one of the reasons why we are in the position we're in today.
Well, and it's always a fight too. I mean, there's the business with the millennials and some of the Xers in terms of their mis or maleducation, and we'll work on that. But it's always a fight to remain holy as God calls you to be holy. And as we walk through each of these topics, right, there's just the fundamental biblical call. You need to be different. You need to be like your Savior. You need to love everybody for who they are, regardless of their orientation, their skin color, or their immigration status. You need to continue to always do what's right for your kids, for you. If you're a father, then you're going to be judged on that, and I'm terrified by that, as we all should be, right? But do better. And so it's just one of those things where, like, you get this little piece of pop culture, this little piece of pop culture, but the word of God remains the same. I give you Isaiah 40.
And believers, those who are disciples of Christ, they are to gravitate towards association with Jesus Christ and with the holiness that is there, and not to associate with culture. Now, I mean, to so that they are linked to culture. We are not to be linked.
Identity.
We are, yes. Our identity is not in the world which surrounds us. Our identity is in the Lord Jesus Christ, and that always has to be our focus.
And man, is that hard?
It is hard.
Because all of this stuff that we've talked about is a distraction by Satan.
Yes. Yeah.
And
that's why the path is narrow.
There's not a whole lot I can say about that. I mean, that's what Jesus says, right?
That's right.
And if the cultural part, it's you need to be running after Jesus. Let culture do culture and participate in the parts that are fun and fine and that you get, because there are some fantastic parts of culture.
Yeah.
But always be running after Jesus.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's, again, always going to be a challenge, and Satan throws this thing or that thing up in front of us. And
Yeah, and to sort of tie the whole thing in together, in terms of how we can be useful to the world around us in regards to how we plug into culture, and not that we find our identity in the culture and stuff, but like the Apostle Paul was like a master at this. Like he became what you needed him to be, whether it was a Jew or whether it was this or whether it was that. Like, this is a good example, while at the same time remaining in who God is, and following Christ. So
Yep.
I wonder what today's world would say about this man. Probably nothing good.
no, nothing good. I mean, he's weird. It's one of those things where the culture
he's
still
extreme.
well, this culture still recognizes holiness, absolute holiness, right? It's why we're all convinced that Billy Graham is a saint, and he is, even if we're not Catholic, right? Mother Teresa, again, we just recognize holiness, and there's something that draws us to it. Jesus, right? Like that is what it is. But, if you have any whiff of not saint about you, I'll give you Franklin Graham, where those are big footsteps to fill, big shoes to fill. And Franklin doesn't always do it, right? And until very, very recently, Ravi Zacharias, right? Huge shoes to fill. And the world kind of recognizes it and doesn't know what to do with it. So on a different day we can talk about non-overlapping Christianity.
Right.
Right.
All right, guys. Well, thank you for being here. David, thank you for being here specifically.
Thanks for having me.
Everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode 4 of season 4, and look forward to the next episode in a couple weeks, episode 5. So on that note, adios.
The views presented in this program are not meant to express the specific views of the Lafayette Bible Fellowship. You are listening to